Hi, Dandesh. Thank you for joining back. I just have waiting for quick message from Larry, but if she doesn't, that's fine. We'll start off. Now, looking at, the learning outcome 3, we are focused on understanding, appropriate data collection and data analysis techniques. Now, here is where we are going to be looking at in detail about what is data collection. How do we look at collecting data, whether we go through primary method, secondary method, whether you look at choosing quantitative or qualitative or mixed methods as a research methodology. And depending on that, you're going to be looking at collecting data. So whether it's going to be primary research or secondary research, what is the sample size that you're going to look at? If you undertake primary research, then what techniques are you going to look at? Whether it's going to be, gathering data with surveys, questionnaires, looking at some of the digital tools like, we can use today Google Forms, SurveyMonkey. We can use a lot of other third-party techniques or tools, essentially, which will allow you to automatically collect data while framing up a questionnaire and then publishing it and then disseminating it to, your set of audiences. We will look at the approach of understanding how do we look at then analyzing data. So analysis of data can be done through, certain statistical techniques, which is one of the ones that we use if you're looking at doing quantitative. That means numerical and statistical data analysis. Then we'll be using one of the softwares called Qualmetrics. We can also use something called SPSS, which is statistical package for analyzing data, because you're going to be looking at questionnaires and data collected from various participants. And sometimes if you have questions which have Likert scale, which start with something like -2, go to +2, for example, strongly disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree, then in those cases, you would be needing some of these softwares to be able to do analysis of what has been collected as data when participants, fill questionnaires, surveys, or let's say, for example, let's say the example forms that you send out for the purposes of asking participants to, answer questions or multiple choice questions in your questionnaire or oblique your data, in oblique the survey that you send out for collecting data. And then once we have collected this data, what we're going to be at some stage doing is analysis, and analysis then would be looking at boiling it down or streamlining it down to the fact in terms of how data is then presented. And presentation of data can be done through graphs, through tables, through charts. And these could be bar charts, pie charts, depending on, how complex data is being presented. And some of them could be stack bar charts or, multiple various different types of special charting techniques, which clearly highlight the findings in terms of collection of data that have been done. And then underneath those charts, tables, or graphs, what you do is you also summarize the findings for that particular question or a range of questions under a particular category. So it could be things like demographics, when we talk about, name of the participant, age group of the participant, gender of the participant, and then you look at educational background of the participant, economic status of the participant. So these are all demographics, and they could be, clubbed together under one particular set of questions, which could be looking at demographics of the participants. And when you present this, you could present 5 of these questions in terms of its findings into using one type of graph or chart. And that could basically depict number of participants that have answered this question, what percentage of participants have been male or female, what percentage of participants are having a particular background in terms of education, experience, and income. And this can be done using, stack bar charts or, complex 3D diagrams, which will allow you to summarize the findings that have been collected for a series of questions using techniques which are called, techniques. When I say, what I mean by that is tools like graphs, charts, and, tables. And that would help the reader or the audience which is going to read the research to identify the findings of, or say, for example, the type of participants which have participated in contributing towards the data that you've collected for your research project. And then there is where we also look at theoretically studying some of the advantages or disadvantages of using certain types of software. And when we look at certain types of software, here we are going to be looking at understanding which would be the best software to use. Sometimes when we have limited number of, if you go with qualitative data collection, sometimes because of the limited type of data types, data types could be audio, video, it could be questions, it could be surveys. But when you have limited data types and when it is subjective data that you've collected, basis group discussions, focus group interviews, then in those cases, you could also use simple techniques, simple software like Excel or Microsoft Excel or spreadsheets to be able to collate data and present those findings. But in some cases, if you're using to collect different forms of data and it is done through collection from a number of participants, that means the sample size is going into 100, 150 or more, then in those cases, you're going to be looking at falling back onto the use of softwares like Qualmetrics or SPSS, or softwares which are predominantly related to like Survey Gizmo, wherein some part of this as a process can be automated. That means once the participants answer or provide answers to your questions or your survey, then in those cases the software is able to tabulate the findings and put this across for you in the form of charts, tables, and graphs. So the presentation of findings, first collection of data and the data collection techniques that you use, and post that the collection of data into putting them into findings or summarizing the findings from the data which have been collected using various charting techniques would be the essence of studying, the learning outcome 4, which focuses, learning outcome 3, which focuses on using appropriate techniques to communicate research findings for your project. Now, here we are going to be looking at understanding what is data collection first. So when we look at data and when we look at collection of data collection is a process through which you're looking at gathering information from a targeted set of audience, and it is very clearly defined in terms of what data and what type of data you're going to collect from your participants. And this will be related directly to the objectives which have been set for the purposes of research. Some part of this data that you're going to collect will also be informed from the literature review that you're carried out. That means you have studied certain articles, reports, government reports, or reports which have been published in organizations, websites and things like that. And they would also relate to the topic research questions that you have put, and on the basis of which you're going to carry out this particular research. Now, there are different types of data collection techniques. Some of them I've listed them on the slides. They are broken down into primary and secondary data collection techniques. Primary tend to be through interviews, surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, or techniques through which you are collecting data firsthand. That means you're speaking to the source, and then you are collecting that data. Secondary techniques tend to be through published reports, published research, government websites, reports which are published on organizational, data websites, and in some cases, third-party websites which have published this research report in the context of, making the data freely available across the general population. Now, depending on what you do and which method you take, which is going to be defined in the research methodology that we discussed earlier, would essentially be the, all this would be defined in your research methodology, because this is what will, the research methodology will essentially clearly highlight what are the set of activities that you're going to undertake to be able to collect this data. And the collection of this data would fall into these 8 or 9 different types of activities. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, you're also going to be looking at mixed methods. That means you're going to go and carry out a research because not enough data is being collected or is available by looking at speaking to participants directly. So in some cases, if I was to look at collecting data for business recovery, and this is related to the fact that if I look at a Primark outlet or if I look at a Marks and Spencer outlet, I want to find out how did the business fare during the COVID pandemic for this particular outlet. Now, if the outlet is in a busy retail area or a retail, let's say, showroom, and this particular company's retail outlet is in a big mall or a big shopping outlet or a big shopping mall, and in those cases, if it gets a lot of traffic from customers in terms of walk-ins and retail customers coming in to buy, and we have some idea in terms of what has been the turnover of the say the outlet. In the past year before pandemic, past couple of years before pandemic, the outlet was maybe selling clothes to the tune of 6 or 7 million pounds, when we look at annual sales. And if you look at during COVID, if the sales dropped to 2 or 3 million pounds, or maybe in certain timeframes of the year when the lockdowns were introduced, if the sale had literally fallen down to zero, then in those cases, when you go about collecting data from the retail outlet, you might have limited audience to collect this data from. One is data collected from, reports which are generated on the tills. Second would be data that you collect from, speaking to the manager or the supervisor within the outlet, maybe some of the employees or staff, which essentially, help out in the day-to-day operations of the outlet, running of the outlet. But beyond that, any form of data collection would not be available to you because, one, this is confidential data. Second, it is not published on an individual showroom website. Third, the data from this particular showroom is not either published separately in the annual general report of the company. So in some cases, what will happen is that you have limitations here in terms of collection of data because the number of sources from which you are going to collect is limited. But in some cases, in order to augment this collection of data, what you are then going to do is basically look at secondary methods, which is to say you're going to look at quantitative data collection. And in those cases, you're going to go across to reports which have been published, look at websites, look at company websites, look at research websites. You might also decide to speak to some of the customers or collect, surveys that would be essentially directly answering questions that are related to your research and research topic. And this would allow you to collect data which is going to be enough for you to conclude and successfully, let's say, research the objectives that you have set for your project, which is to understand how long would it take, as an example, if the topic was how long would it take for the customers to come back to the outlets after the COVID-19 pandemic? How long will it take for the sales to recover? If the pre-pandemic level of sales was about 7 to 8 million annually, and if it is starting off at 2 or 3 million or a million or so after the pandemic, then how long what factors and how much time would it take for the sales to recover? Then in those cases, you might have to choose mixed methods because you want to go across to multiple sources of data multiple sources essentially to be able to collect data that would be meaningful for you to predict how long will it take for the outlet to recover to the pre-pandemic levels in terms of its sales and sales turnover. So in those cases, you're going to be looking at collecting data which is going to come across from multiple sources. Now, data collection is a very vital part of your research project because this is where you're going to be going into the depths of analysis in terms of uncovering reasons which are going to come from the activities that you're undertaking to understand why this has happened or why the sales have declined. And that would be all done through the process of understanding data and data collection. So here you're going to be looking into going into details of the various methods and the techniques which is going to be most optimum and suitable for you to be able to collect data, and that is going to be helping you to draw meaningful conclusions for your research project. So let's watch a small video which basically talks about data collection techniques, and what essentially is the process of, why is this an important process in the overall scheme of things when we conduct, research. So I've looked at one particular video, and then it's a short video of about 2 minutes, and let's understand what is data collection and how data collection is done in terms of, looking at research when we carry out this activity.
What's the best data collection method for your business? Data collection is the process of gathering data for business decision-making, strategic planning, research, and more. It provides the information needed to answer questions, analyze business performance, and predict future trends. Data collection happens on multiple levels. For instance, IT systems continuously collect data on customers, employees, and sales. Data can also be manually collected with surveys and by tracking social media. For research in science and medicine, data collection is often a more specialized process. Regardless of the context, data is often collected from multiple sources and usually with a variety of techniques. To read about an argument in favor of automated data collection, click the link above or in the description below. Customer data, for example, can be collected unknowingly, like from transaction records, cookies, website visits, social media tracking, and keyword tracking, or knowingly, like with customer forms, loyalty programs, surveys, service agreements, and competitions. Well-designed data collection processes typically follow these steps. Identify a business or research issue and set goals for the project. Gather data requirements to answer the business or research questions. Identify the data sets that can provide the necessary information. Set a plan for collecting the data, including collection methods. And collect the available data and begin prepping it for analysis. Recent privacy laws, such as GDPR, make data privacy and security bigger considerations when collecting data, particularly if it contains personal information about customers.
So this is where it's an important point. Sometimes when you design your questionnaires and you design your survey forms, if you're looking at doing primary data collection, then nowadays GDPR and data protection laws have to be followed in order to look at collecting this data and then using it for the purposes of research. So one of the things that you would note when we send out a questionnaire or a survey or some sort of let's say a questionnaire to the, let's say, some sort of data collection form to your customers. Normally most of it is done through the electronic routes, through Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, or some of the other advanced softwares. But here, before you send this across, what you have to look at is you have to also include something which is called a participant information form. And sometimes we also include what is called a participant consent form, PCF. Now, the reason of doing this is that what you do in the participant consent form is to briefly explain the process of your research, what the data is, what kind of data is going to be collected, and you're expecting what form of data to be provided by the participant. And then how is this data going to be used for the purposes of your research? And will this data be published at a later stage? Will the data be anonymized so that the identity of the individual is protected under the data protection laws? This type of information is going to be provided to your participant who are going to contribute to your research in what is called the participant consent form. And the consent form gives a bit of an introduction about your research, your process, the data being collected, and how that is going to be used. And at a later stage, once the participant has gone through this, they will either give consent, which is to say, yes, that I'm happy to participate in this research and my data can be used under conditions of anonymity for the purposes of research, or they might outright refuse it. And that is a choice that you have to give to your participants to say that they do not want to participate in this research if the research findings are going to be published, even if they are anonymized, but they have the ability to be able to decline consent to or participating in your research and then providing data. the consent form is slightly different from the participant information form is because once the consent has been granted, that means I have chosen that I have said yes to your research and I would be happy to contribute my side of data towards the questionnaire or the survey being served to me. But at a later stage, what we also then do is get a participant information form filled in, wherein some of the basic details of the participant are fed in, and they are kept for the purposes of research on file. And when at a later stage, when data is synthesized and obviously presented in the research report, some part of that data, depending on the consent which has been given and the information that you hold about that participant from the PIF form, participant information form, is then anonymized to ensure that the data protection laws are followed and the identity of the individual is protected when presenting the data as an overall part of your report. So this is quite important. And I think as most of you would learn and obviously at some stage go about doing, say, major research projects or dissertations at a higher level, at level 6 or 7, this part of the activity, which is called the PIF and PCF, become a key part of your proposal, because this is where the university or this is where the participants and the researcher would get a consent from various authorities to be able to carry out these research activities. And they become quite important when you're doing a dissertation, which is at the master's level or at the bachelor's level in the final year, wherein they ask you to do a research project, which will be about 10 to 12,000 words, and at the master's level, 15 to 20,000 words. And if I look at PhD or MPhil level, maybe 30 to 60,000 word thesis, which has to be written. And this part of participant information form will also then include what are called ethical considerations, which is where you will use and mention some of the ethical considerations in terms of collection of data and how that is going to be used. And this has to be published and taken permission of even before you start your research. So this then becomes a part of what is called your research proposal, essentially when it is submitted to your supervisor for the purposes of getting consent to start your research project. So it's an important thing that you need to be aware of and have knowledge about. At this level, you might be drawing up the consent form and the information form and attach it as an annexure to your research project. But maybe the practical applications of this is where you put into action when you're carrying out a research project at the master's level or a dissertation, as I say, and that is a mandatory must to have in terms of the proposal and the consent which is required to get from the participants of your research, because you'll be sending that across to maybe 200, 300, 400, 500 participants, and that is where the consent has to be taken and information in detail has to be provided about your research, on the basis of which the participants then look at consenting to participating in the research.
An organization's data governance program should include policies to ensure that data.
So I'll repeat that.
When collecting data. Privacy and security bigger considerations when collecting data, particularly if it contains personal information about customers. An organization's data governance program should include policies to ensure that data collection practices comply with laws such as GDPR. What are the biggest challenges in your organization when collecting data? How did you overcome them? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure.
So this is where what you would need to do is understand how and why data collection is to be done, because obviously you're looking at uncovering, let's say, the reasons behind some of the research objectives that you have, and that is where your data collection becomes center to what you're carrying out in the research project. Now, when I look at talking about research, and when we look at talking about data collection in particular, what we are looking at this stage is, yeah, that's a good point, Nandesh. So it is also sometimes there's a conflict of interest when you carry out research, and that could be conflicting with some of the objectives of the organization or maybe the individual, and that could also be one of the reasons why you need to get a consent from the participant. So that's a good point. Now, one of the things that you have to look at when we look at, collection of your data, you have to relate it to what kind of research you're going to, what is your research objectives. And in this case, how would the collection of data relate to the research objectives that you have? So in this particular research, you're going to be looking at primary research, and primary research is focused on things like, originality, relevance, accuracy, and reliability, because what you're looking at doing is you're collecting data directly from the source. That means you're going to the horse's mouth to be able to get hold of the data, which could be through methods like surveys, interviews, observations, experiment, and focus groups. This is what you will look at primarily, which is the primary data. Now, although primary data is quite helpful because it helps you get data from the sources mouth, and that means there is very little dilution or very little misinterpretation which can happen because you're collecting the data directly from the source. However, when you look at primary data collection, there are also some disadvantages. One is that primary data collection methods tend to be flexible. That means you have to sometimes eradicate or leave out questionnaires or data collected which are incomplete, which have not been completed in the due process on time, and that would mean that sometimes you have to be flexible, because if participants opt out at a later stage during the research, you might have to take that data out. And then last but not the least, you also have to look at that sometimes the data being collected might be extremely rich or maybe more detailed as compared to when it is collected from variety of sources. And this could be because of the attitude, beliefs, and behavior of the individual. And in some cases, if you look at collection of data from an example that I would give you here is if you're collecting data from individuals which are highly literate or have a certain type of education at a certain level, then the methods, then say, for example, the data that you gather from them as compared to some of the individuals which have not had that level of education or maybe experience, that data might be, the two data sets might kind of contradict what is being collected for the purposes of research because of the richness of data, which is to say sometimes more information or more intricate or detailed information will trickle in. And in some of the questionnaires, that information might be very, very rudimentary or primary, which is only related to, answering the information in yes and no. And that way you will sometimes feel that your research outcome can be skewed. And last, one of the most important things that you have to remember when we talk about primary data collection techniques, they are considered to be generally more time consuming and more costly. The reason is because you have to collect the data from the source. Sometimes it includes travel costs. It also includes cost. That means you have to go through some of these bits again. If you're doing an interview using a focus group, you might have an hour-long interview, a half an hour-long interview. It could be subjective, depending on what type of answers individuals might give. And you might have to go through it again in order to get to the data set that you're trying to get. And that is where it tends to be more time-consuming and more expensive. So this is something that you have to keep in mind when you look at choosing data collection techniques for the purposes of doing your research. Now, if we look at typical, if I give you some suggestions of typical sample sizes, depending on your research methodology, and research design, if you end up taking qualitative research, and if you take up quantitative research or mixed methods, what I've done here is I've given some suggested ideas in terms of what could be the sample size that you would need to look at in order to come to or draw meaningful conclusions from your research project. Now, when we look at qualitative, sometimes this tends to be purposeful sampling, which is about 10 to 30 participants. There is another method called snowball sampling, and that tends to be between 20 to 50 participants, and convenience sampling, which is between 10 to 20 candidates. Now, I don't know in terms of because at this stage you need to learn theoretically about the sampling techniques and how you would go about doing it. So what I would suggest is look at this as a bit of a suggested suggested example for when you look at, sampling techniques. Now, in terms of quantitative in any case is something which is related to, numbers. And when we talk about numbers, and obviously we talk about, statistics. Here, your simple random sampling, which is one of the techniques wherein you're looking at about, 100 to 500 participants. Then we talk about stratified, sampling, random sampling. And this would mean 50 to 200 participants, and cluster sampling. Now, let's briefly look at quickly the definitions of snowball sampling. Now, this is a new term which I think some of you would have heard. So when we talk about snowball sampling, this is a non-probability based sampling method wherein you would normally add new participants to your existing sample if you feel that you're not getting the requisite results to the objectives which have been set for the purposes of your research. For example, in this case of a snowball sampling, if it was a very rare disease, then you would struggle to find participants. So what will happen is, in order to complete your research and get to meaningful data and findings, you will keep adding participants because of the fact that the number of participants available for some sort of sampling would be very, very few, or let's say scant in the market as far as that is concerned. So in those cases, what you're going to look at is the process of snowball sampling. So here each individual will be looked at in detail. And here, if the researchers feel that if they are conducting this study and they find it difficult to find more participants, they're going to keep adding it. And that's why the snowball effect. So you start with one. And when we look at, making iceman, snowmans and things like that, you start with a very small snowball and you keep rolling it, it becomes big, and then you use it as so that is the logic behind, this particular technique. Now, if I look at stratified sampling would typically be, talking about the concept wherein we are looking at the method through which we are going to divide the population into smaller subgroups, because there are lots of demographic groups. So we have A, B, C, C1. So sometimes within the A sub demographic groups, which is maybe say in a certain age group, certain illiteracy level, certain income level, the highest, if we call it, you might want to further divide it. And in those cases, division of the population to get more intricate data, you create what are called subgroups, and that would be strata. And that is why the word stratified random sampling. So you start with a small group, but that group can essentially be further subdivided into smaller subgroups. And this would be done on the basis of characteristics, their behavior, their attitude, the income, or the educational background. And that would be the reason why you look at, stratified sampling. So simple example of stratified sampling would be if I was carrying out my research and I had taken a target age group, just as an example. If I had taken a target age group and I say my target audience is between 19 to 75. So it's a very big, age group that you're taking. But if I then have to narrow it down and I say 18 to 25 and I say 26 to 30, and then I say 31 to 40, and I say 41 to 50, then what I'm doing is essentially looking at dividing the population into, smaller subgroups on the basis of their age. And this would be basically a process through which I would get representative data for the whole sample population, but it will come in a strata. That means in some sort of, subgroups. And that is why the process will be called as, stratified sampling. And cluster, I don't know if you've come across, but cluster sampling tends to be 100 to 1,000 participants. Here, you're looking at a probability sampling method in which you will divide the population into clusters. So if I look at somebody doing like a local council or a government doing like, say, let's say, collection of data, or like the voters' roll. The government sometimes conducts a census, and what they have to do is divide the city into various parts, districts, schools, and things like that. And what they then do is, after the division of the population or the city into different clusters, they would then randomly go across and collect samples from different types of clusters. So one cluster could be schools, the other could be hospitals, the third could be, say, for example, local authorities. And in those cases, they would be using probability-based sampling, which is going to use and divide the population into clusters. And these clusters would then represent or give them a representative sample. And that is where you look at cluster sampling as a method of collecting data. Now, all these would fall under quantitative because it's involving numbers. One such example that I would give you is, for example, if the government wanted to find out during the COVID pandemic, for example, how many individuals have got affected with COVID virus. Now, there was one way of doing it is that government goes to each of the house and knocks on each of the doors within a city and then asks the population about, whether you're infected or whether anybody in the family is infected. The other way could be make telephone calls, send out text messages, blah, blah, blah. But because they want to look at if this is to be declared as a pandemic, that means it has to go beyond a certain size of affecting the population. Then in this case, in order to study a large spread out population, what the government would do is basically divide the population into clusters. And in order to save time, in order to save costs, and also to ensure that the sample and the conclusions they come up to are accurate, what they will do is what is called the cluster sampling. And that would mean they would sample different types of population broken down into different or smaller representation of the population in terms of groups with similar characteristics, and then they would go about doing the sampling. And this would be, looking at probability-based sampling in order to, arrive at a conclusion whether this is something that they need to declare as a pandemic, or whether this is something, sometimes when you have this raises of alert. So the climate alert, or, for example, the flood alert has been raised to level 1, then level 2, then level 3, and highest is level 4. So if that has to be done, then it would look at representative sampling of population which are closer to, say, for example, living near a lock or a canal or a river, and how many properties are flooded. They will do a sampling through the basis of cluster size. That means they will look at sampling houses which are dotted around the river basin for a number of miles, in a particular area, to see how many properties are flooded. And that would be the process through which they will look at cluster sampling. Now, when you look at mixed methods, what you're looking at in the mixed methods is you could do combination of quantitative and qualitative sampling. And here again, there are different types of sampling methods which are available. One is sequential, second is concurrent, and the third is sequential transformative. Now, the sample participant size can vary between 50 to 500, but depending on what type of method we are using, sometimes, you would be looking at sequential exploratory design method, and you could also be looking at concurrent triangulation design method. Now, what are the differences between the two? If I have to very, very briefly explain, the exploratory sequential mixed method is designed wherein it is characterized by initial qualitative phase of data collection. And at a later stage, it starts with 10 to 20 participants. So it is qualitative sample, which is then followed up with a phase of data collection, which is going to expand into what is called quantitative sample. That means in order to confirm the findings which have been done by collection of data from 10 to 20 people or participants, it will then further go into detailing by expanding the sample size. That is where quantitative sample comes in order to then link the data findings which have been got from doing a smaller sample. So qualitative. So essentially, this would be, initial part would start off as qualitative. Qualitative means quality sample, and then it will be followed by quantity sample of data in order to confirm the linkage or the finding between the, let's say, the findings for maybe a problem or and uncovering the issue. Then when we look at concurrent, concurrent triangulation method, here what we are going to look at is going to start with qualitative sample, and then at some stage what we are going to do is go into quantitative sampling, but the data between the two samples that we do collection of is going to be done concurrently. So we'll start off with the quality sample of 10 to 20 participants, but at the same time, we'll start collecting data from a majority of participants involved in the research, and that data is going to be collected concurrently. Now, here, the reason of collecting data concurrently is to cross-validate and corroborate on the findings which are being done for the purpose of a particular study. So here, if you look at an example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government started to look at, obviously when hospitalization started to increase, the government started to look at collecting samples of, say, collecting blood samples or samples of people who were essentially infected with the COVID virus. But the sampling did not stop because there were different variants of the virus coming as well. So the government then expanded its program of collecting more data in order to discover the variants of those viruses within the population. And here they could not stop that purpose of sampling because they knew that the virus is mutating. And if there were severe symptoms being faced by the patients because of the variants of the virus, then that data was more critical for collection so that the government and the agencies, several agencies, could introduce, measures to contain and control the spread of that virus. So here, the data collection continued concurrently rather than stopping to find out whether if the variant of the virus was discovered. They went into more detailing to increase the sample size to detect in how many different individuals or, in what percentage of the population was this variant being discovered in addition to the core virus, because it was mutating. So that would be the process of looking at, concurrent, the triangulation design. And then the last one that I want to talk about is sequential transformative, method. And in this case, what you are looking at is the key part is transformative design. That means here in this approach, we are looking at basically focusing on a single phase to collect data first, which is through a major part of the population or participants. And then at a later stage, in order to confirm that there are no more variants of the virus, for example, we would then go out and do a subjective or a quality sample as well. And that is the exact opposite of the concurrent triangulation design method. Here, what we are going to do is go and collect a wider sample first, and then narrow it down in terms of findings to do a subjective sample through the qualitative method. Now, these methods, at this stage, you have to look at theoretically, but at some stage when you start your research and when you start looking at data collection, you're going to focus on qualitative or quantitative. And I think in most cases, you're going to go with quantitative for the purposes of topic that you select. And in most cases, it is going to be one of the simple process of in terms of techniques would be to look at just simple random sampling by sending out questionnaires and sending out surveys. So this is just for understanding at this stage. And then I've explained these terms and meanings as I've gone ahead, which you can go through. Now, when we look at research today, and if I look at 20 years back, there is a difference in terms of how we collect data. Technology comes to our rescue. And what we see, there are lots of tools available which will allow us to gather data electronically. by sending some of these off as electronic forms, surveys, questionnaires, and then the customers or the participants that you have who are going to participate and contribute in terms of data would be able to do so by using multiple choice questions or simple techniques through which they are able to fill these forms online. And some of these softwares like Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, Survey Gizmo, Qualmetrics, some of them are free and some of them are paid for. And what is the advantage of using these softwares? Say, for example, Google Forms and SurveyMonkey, to a certain extent, they will allow you to tabulate the findings from the surveys, the questionnaires, the data collected into graphs, charts, and tables automatically. That is the advantage of having and using these, I would say, softwares or data gathering, techniques which are available through the advancement in software. This wasn't probably available 20 years back. So now, sometimes when questionnaires and forms have to be sent out, they can be quickly made once through the electronic routes. And once they are created, the questionnaire and the forms are perfected, you can email them, you can send them across as a mail blast, as a newsletter, and then your participants are given time with some sort of things like ending in terms of timeline before they have to respond. Incorrect responses or incomplete responses can be straight away rejected by the software, and it allows you to tabulate accurately the data which has been collected from the participants. Now, these softwares also help you in validating, editing, coding, and analysis of the data, as I mentioned to you. So validation means complete forms will only be taken if you define it as conditions. Complete forms with the questions answered to answers to all the questions are going to be then tabulated for the purposes of findings. It allows you to edit in some cases if there are spelling errors or if there are any sort of errors which are let's say typographical errors, then they can be corrected by using the software and the editing techniques. You could also look at coding. Like, for example, when we talk about Likert scale, wherein I gave you an example earlier that if you have your questions based on strongly disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree, this is called the Likert scale, wherein you are basically using negative to positive and giving the participant a bias to be, a range of answers using multiple type questions to collect data. So here, if you feel that the participants could be biased by providing this kind of a scale, you could do some coding in the questionnaires itself to prevent this to happen. And that can be also done by the use of softwares. And obviously analysis becomes easy because if you post your hypothesis and put the variables into for the purposes of testing and sampling, the software is able to, obviously do this for you. And some of the softwares which I've mentioned here, Qualmetrics in particular, SPSS in particular, can do that part if it has been, coded into, and the questionnaire detailing and the results of the answers to the questions have also been coded. Then it can present the findings in a tabulated form on the software itself. Now, there are some examples that I would mention in particular when we talk about, let's say the advantages of these methods. Now, depending on the type of research that you choose, you would have some advantages of certain types of data collection techniques. When I talk about surveys, interviews, observations, experiments obviously will not be probably used when you do this. Case study and then content analysis. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages. This is what you need to theoretically understand. So my suggestion would be to go through this particular table which I've created, which clearly lists out some of the advantages of the methods, which is primary methods and secondary data collection methods or techniques. And then if I am going to use various forms of softwares, then I have also mentioned certain advantages and disadvantages of different types of softwares that can be used for the purposes of, data collection as well as data analysis. So in some cases, we can also use Excel spreadsheets. SPSS is a very popular software which is used primarily by, lots of people or researchers essentially, when we talk about SPSS stands for Statistical Package for Social Sciences. It's a software now owned by IBM. It is free to download from the IBM website. I think you'll be able to download it for a period of 60 days as a trial. And I would suggest that if some of you want to try out SPSS and understand how the software works, things like that, there are nice tutorials available on the IBM website. My suggestion would be to design your questionnaire and send it out through Google Forms at some stage, and or SurveyMonkey. And then once you've had your data back, that would be the ideal time for you to then download the software and start a 60-day trial wherein you'll be putting in the output of your research questionnaires or surveys to get meaningful conclusions using the software. So this is a very, very complex software. It is used in all forms of research, especially at the very advanced level. And I would suggest that some of this, if you want to obviously get experience of using SPSS apart from Excel or some of the other simple tools like Google Forms and Qualmetrics and SurveyMonkey, then this would be something good for you to try. Depending on time availability and looking at the sampling techniques or the number of participants that you're looking at collecting data from. So this chapter that we've discussed now helps you understand what is data collection, what are data collection techniques, what are the different types of techniques that you can employ when you choose the methodology of your data collection. And then last but not the least, how do you use the advances in technology, which is essentially softwares, to be able to look at drawing meaningful conclusions for you on the basis of what data has been collected, analyzed by the software, and then presented or created in the form of graphs, tables, and chart in some cases when you use softwares like Qualmetrics, Google Forms, and SurveyMonkey. So they'll be able to present your data as charts and graphs and summarize them in the form of meaningful results. Now, one thing which I want to show you just as an output, one is to basically talk about this, but what I also want to do is show you an output. And the reason I want to show you an output is to put this into a bit of perspective in terms of seeing how software actually enables this part from a point of view of collection of data and surveys. So what I'm going to do is switch you over to the website. And what I want to do is obviously show you some of the results of surveys that we do and are collected on the website, and the softwares actually do all the analysis and the compilation of the data collected from the participants. Now, I've gone into the back end of a website wherein what I would want to do is basically show you some course survey results. Now, there is a questionnaire which has been created, and this questionnaire essentially, has lots of entries. And what I would do is show this in parts in terms of how Google Forms, or, in our case, we use a specific form which allows you to create these questionnaires, which can be then served to multiple students in our case, and that allows the software to receive the responses and then compile it from a purposes of coming to meaningful results. Now, just to give you an example, this is a survey questionnaire that we've designed to collect feedback from our students. So it's a course survey, which was for June 22. We have got some basic details which are designed as a form of a questionnaire. So I've got some demographic details like name, email, phone number, and obviously the course they are studying, which can be defined in the software here. Then we have created questions which are based on Likert scale. So here, teaching on the course, learning opportunities, assessment and feedback, these are categories or sets that we have created. And within them, there are a couple of questions: academic support, learning resources, and how is your progress on the course? And then we've left a column here for meaningful, capture of data, wherein learners have an space here to be able to put down their own comments in terms of how they feel about the course and teaching and delivery. And then we put a rating system in towards the end to say, can you rate us in terms of number of stars? And that would basically be, overall rating that the student would give us for the course that they've attended. Now, how the entries collected? If I look at going back to the entries and obviously analyzing some of these entries, what I would then do is go back into, the software. And at some stage, what I would do is essentially go into the entries of it. And give me 1 second. So I'll show you some entries in terms of how the entries are collected and how the software is then, essentially tabulating all the responses which have come in from maybe a couple of couple of hundred students. So I don't know. I'm just looking at this right now, and it'll calculate the findings. And then what it will do is, depending on how the questionnaires have been filled up by the learners, as you can see, this is covered about 93 students, and it is across so many courses. So this software allows us to collect the data and then also interpret the data and the findings. So if I look at, there are, say, how many students across healthcare, 8, strategic management, 34, business and management, 27. Nobody has skipped the questionnaire, as you can see. Now, when we look at various category sets that we created, teaching on the course, as you can see, these are the answers. So 93 have answered, and most of them have answered positively as green. Learning opportunities, again, varied form of answers. So this allows us to, the software, the technology essentially allows us to gather and collect the data and then present it meaningfully for each of the questions asked. They're summarized and, nicely related in terms of percentage. So 62% of the students felt that they have been able to get the academic support from the staff. 65% of them felt that they have the advice and guidance in relation to their course. And this is how the meaningful conclusions come across from and then some of them, have written responses. 15 of them answered in the box, and 78% did not write anything or just wrote, left the box as it is, because that entry is not mandatory. And then the data in terms of presentation of graphs has been done. So how do we rate across? So out of the 5, stars, mostly students have rated us about 4.7 on an average. And that allows us to look at, the data being, collected and obviously then presented through the route of software. So at some stage, when you collect your data and you use some of the methods like Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, or use Qualmetrics. Some of them are free, some of them are paid for, but some of the free services would also come along with the option of you having to analyze your data. And this is where you could take screenshots and then integrate this into your research project to say that these are the findings from my research project. And this is nicely done using the software. Is that okay? Any questions? Any questions at your end on this session today?
No, sir.
Okay, so what I would suggest now is, if I briefly also show you on Moodle, when we go in on Moodle, you are going to be able to see relevant chapters, for this particular learning outcome that we have covered, apart from the presentation. But what I would suggest is, in order to develop a bit more deeper understanding into the main areas of literature review and also data collection techniques, what I would suggest is look at reading the 2 handouts which are available. And these 2 handouts typically talk about, I will open them up and then show you as well. So these 2 handouts are going to be useful for you to develop and a deeper understanding in terms of what we've discussed today in our session. So one of the handout is chapter 2, which is research approach. And this covers, qualitative, quantitative design, and, looking at your research methodology in general. And then it covers data analysis towards the end. So this is going to be quite useful for you to study, which is a which is a 50-page handout, but it will give you a detailed understanding of how to design your research project, what is research methodology, and what is data collection as a technique. Then there is also a handout which has been extracted from a book called Theoretical Perspectives and of Research Methodology. So this particular chapter outline would also then put this into context in terms of when we discuss things like hypothesis testing, what is inductive and deductive research process, how do you look at defining your research methodology in terms of whether you're going to do inductive research, deductive research, whether you're going to use qualitative or quantitative research or mixed methods. This part is very, briefly explained, but the brief is very clearly explained in terms of developing this knowledge of how to look at choosing the research methodology and the method through which you're going to go about collecting the data. And these two handouts are going to be quite useful at crystallizing what we have studied in the two sessions today, which is literature review, followed by research methodology, and then followed by data collection methods and their analysis thereafter. Now, if you think of any questions after this session, feel free to drop me an email, and then we will catch up next week primarily to complete this part of the unit. But before we complete this part of the unit, what you have to do next week is to be able to come up with a research proposal of 1 page or 2 page. And I'm going to try and put 1 or 2 samples of that onto the website so that you are able to essentially come up with a sample research proposal. And that would mean that you get that approval in principle before you start the research project, so that the proposal and the topic that you pick up is going to be appropriate, is not going to be something which is going to be very, very difficult, and something not going to be very generic. And that is what I would suggest that you need to do so by sending me a Word document on learner work at ukversity.co.uk. And I'm going to show you some samples of research and research proposals. The reason I want to do that is so that you have a bit of perspective. It is available on your side, typically on Moodle. So this is an example of a research proposal, which is to say, this is not related to business recovery, but there is an example of a research proposal. It says examination of service quality, customer satisfaction, and loyalty in the fast food market of UK. So in the proposal, you've given us a brief outline of what the research is going to be, or the UK fast food market is. What is the aims of your research? What sources are you going to consider for literature review? And then towards the end, you've discussed about the methodology that you're going to put in place to be able to carry the research, a conceptual framework if you're looking at testing the hypothesis, a brief, on research design and methodology, and the methods you're going to use for sampling on data collection, and then what kind of conclusion you're expecting to draw is actually given in this proposal. Now, this is a rather quite detailed version of the proposal, which I would suggest if you do so at the start, then you're going to be very, very clear in terms of what you're going to research, target market, sample size, and then the findings are going to be you're going to come or arrive to findings which are going to be expected at your end. Just to give you a quick example of a questionnaire as well. In your case, if you're going to go across with primary methods, you'll have to design a questionnaire. It could be 15 to 20 questions. I've not included any demographics on this, but just as an example, you might have 3 sections to the questionnaire. One part would be the demographics, which is collecting information about the participant. Second part is going to be related to your research objectives and your literature review. And the third is going to be focused on, your research conceptual design and testing of your hypothesis. So questions with suggested, answers in terms of what are the options that you're going to give to the participant to be able to agree or disagree. And that has to be drawn up in the questionnaire. I wouldn't recommend anything more than 20 questions. Ideally, it should be more between 10 to 15. at this level. But if you do decide anything more than 20, I think this would be making it complicated for the purposes of, collection and analysis of your data at any given stage. So my suggestion would be to keep it succinct and keep it very particular to, the research topic that you are looking at doing, and that would be, good enough. One other thing which I would want to show you, just as an example of a research proposal, is that this obviously is a bit of a report, but if you see in the research proposal, the learner has clearly depicted the 4 or 5 chapters that you're going to be looking at covering, and that is introduction, you have literature review, you have research methodology, you have research methods, data collection, and then finally results and discussion, basically results or findings of your results. And that is what your proposal should be in synopsis, maybe 2 pages, 3 pages, but you have these 5 broad chapters that are covered in your research proposal, which gives rationale of research, background of research, aims and objectives. What are the sources that you're going to consider for literature review or review of the literature, which is essentially existing data already published, what methodology you're going to follow, methods that you're going to use to collect data, and then what kind of findings do you expect to present when you complete your research. Here, I would suggest to include a timeline, essentially, which is the Gantt chart, and that could be something which normally is also presented, along with the proposal, which basically would be a maximum 8-week timeline to say that I'm going to be looking at conducting the research for these particular under these particular headings. And when I do so, I'm going to be looking at spending this much time appropriately on, these activities, which could be looking at researching and reading about what is my research title, rationale of research, and the aims and objectives, maybe a week or 2 weeks. Then after that, 2 weeks for literature review, 3 weeks for maybe 2 days or 3 days for research methodology and design of my research in terms of strategy that I will undertake these activities. Then 3 weeks for the collection of data, 1 or 2 weeks for the collection and compilation of findings, and then presentation of the findings in the final week to conclude my research and my research project. Is that okay? So these samples
Yes,
I will put across on Moodle so that you are able to see and, obviously use them for the purposes of reference. And then using these, draw up something appropriate related to your topic. Nandish, in your case, it is going to be business recovery, and choose one of the subtopics in that. And Larem, in your case, it is going to be specifically any topic, but your aim is to, draw up the proposal, and that would be meeting the requirements of your assignment. So at this stage, I'm going to try and end the session for today, and then we'll catch up next week to discuss briefly about how we are progressing on this unit. And then, hopefully on Sunday, start a new unit, which is going to be which is going to be the new unit on, business, and I think business and understanding and leading change. So take care, and thanks for joining in for today. And this session is going to be available on YouTube along with the previous session, should you need to watch this again. So they are both available on our YouTube channel, and then I'll catch up with you next week.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for attending. Bye for now.